Actions Program. I'm Bill Miller. What are the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, such as reducing abject poverty and promoting sustainable development? What are various countries, such as the least developed countries, small island states, and landlocked countries doing to help achieve these two goals, as well as the other 6? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, as well as what a large group of countries at the United Nations is doing to help achieve these goals. My guest is an expert in this area. My guest today is His Excellency Gyan Acharya of Nepal, who is the Undersecretary General for the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. Formerly, the Undersecretary General Acharya was a permanent representative of Nepal to the United Nations. Prior to coming to the UN, he held the post of Nepal's permanent representative to the UN and World Trade Organization in Geneva, as well as Nepal's ambassador in Switzerland. Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Undersecretary General, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you being with me today.
Right.
Let's jump right into this. We've had quite a lumping of countries there, with the least developed countries, the small island development states, and the landlocked developing states. What exactly is this group that you're heading, and what exactly are some of their goals and mission of it?
This is a very important set of groups. What we are trying to do is that, United Nations has membership of all the countries around the world. Now, among them, there are some groups of countries which are at a disadvantaged position because of their structural difficulties, because of their high level of poverty, and because of the very high level of vulnerability. Now, first, let us look at the least developed countries, because that is based on the criteria that we have, the low level of income, low level of human and social development, and high level of vulnerability. So to say, I would say that these are the countries which are at the bottom of the development ladder from every perspective, from the income perspective, from the other human development like health, education, and the gender empowerment, as well as the economic growth. But if you look at the other groups of countries, they are there because of their typical geographical position. For example, landlocked developing countries means there are 31 of them in the world. Well, there are others as well, but they are only those which are from the developing countries. Those which are developed, like Switzerland and Austria, are not a member of this particular group, because they have already a position. They have already reached a position whereby they really are not looking at that type of cooperation at the global level, but of course they are working by themselves. But these countries are those which don't have access to the sea, direct access to the sea, which means that they have to go through the other country in order to reach the sea. Now, what does it mean? It means that if they are having an international trade with others, they have to have a very strong collaboration with them. They have to have a very good infrastructure in order to really go towards the sea. And that means that this is an extra cost, this is a more collaboration with the countries around the world. And then when you look at the neighboring countries of these countries, they themselves are also, the transit countries, which we call them, they themselves are developing countries. So you have to find a way to find a very strong collaboration, very strong infrastructural linkages in order to have a very good trade with them, in order to have also a good collaboration, as well as to get due benefit from the globalization around the world. And the third group of countries that that I'm responsible in terms of promoting and advocating their interests and aspirations is the small islands. There is also another geographic handicap. Small islands means they have a very small population. They are scattered in the vast ocean, and they have, most of them are like coral atolls, which means that the internal transportation is very expensive, and also the external transportation is very expensive. And of course, because they are, as I said, very small, the economy is small, the high level of poverty, very difficult for integrating themselves with the global community. And whether you talk about cost of doing business, the transaction cost for these two groups of countries, it is very high. So what the United Nations is trying to look at is that because of their unique vulnerabilities and the unique characteristics, United Nations is trying to make sure that their issues and concerns which are typical are also looked at by the international community, and also they are provided with as much support as possible in terms of policies, in terms of resources, in terms of cooperation and collaboration, and maybe having better international governance that can also take care of their interest and aspiration. So this is the idea with which this office is working with these member states, but they have their one what you call the coordination bureau. They coordinate among themselves and try to project common interest, not only at the United Nations here, but everywhere where they are a member of that particular organization.
Now, if we just look at one group, the least developed countries, I believe you said 49, is that correct?
That's
49
right.
countries, and that depends upon their income. The income levels, you have to be like under $900 US
That's
or
right.
something like that, and
Right.
then of course the human resource development and their vulnerability.
Right.
How many countries over the past several years have moved from the least development status to being a semi-developed state, shall we say?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's right. I mean, that's the continuous challenge that we face. When you look at the challenges of these countries, it is because of this combination of challenges. It's not only one challenge. It's the income challenge, it's the high level of persistent poverty, and of course the high level of vulnerability. Vulnerability means that either they are dependent on a very one or two products for agriculture or the minerals, or they are exporting one or two products around the world. That's why it is the inherent nature of vulnerability that makes it extremely difficult for them to get out of that. Now, we have a criteria through which we judge them where they are, which means that all the three indicators, the income indicator, the human and social development indicator, and the vulnerability, and we really evaluate their status all the time. The category as such was recognized way back in 1971, but at the time there were very few independent states. But over the period, because there were many many states which became independent, especially in Africa, but also in Asia and Latin America, and then they became a member of this particular group. And if you are looking at some of the graduation, it has been very slow, partly again because of this I would say low equilibrium trap. They are kind of entrapped in a low equilibrium. I mean, you don't have better economic growth because you don't have capital, and you don't have the capital, and because you don't have the human resources, which is very good, or the natural resources. So, and then again, you don't have much investment. So they are a kind of economic, the low equilibrium trap, if you like, they are in. But still, there are a couple of countries which have come out of this status. In the last 10 years, Botswana came out of it. It just became the lower middle income out of that. And then Cape Verde also came out of it. And just recently, a couple of years ago, it was Maldives, which has just come out of it. Now, early this year, January, which is in the next week, because there is always a transition process, and we look at their, the indicators all the time. Samoa is getting out of it this year, and there are two more countries which have been recommended, and they have started the process of getting graduated, like Equatorial Guinea and Vanuatu. So there is some movement, and which is something that we appreciate, because that shows that they are moving upwards, which means that their situation is getting better. But there is a long way to go. Just to briefly tell you that when we had a conference in Istanbul, the LDCs, the least developed countries themselves, said that they wanted to have as many countries graduate as possible in the next 10 years. Their aspiration is very high. They would like to see half of them even graduate for that. But when we look at some of these countries getting out of it, there is some hope. Yeah.
Well, if our viewers would like more information, they can go to www.unohrlls.org, or they could just Google your office, least developed countries, and they will find you for sure.
Yeah.
You mentioned Istanbul. That was a good segue. That was in 2011, as I recall, and it was a major conference. You developed a major strategic plan, a program of action. What were some of the recommendations that were encompassed in that program of action to help the least developed countries?
These type of conferences takes place every 10 years for these groups of countries. You are right that for the LDCs, it was Istanbul in Turkey that we organized. The United Nations organized a conference way back in 2011. But what we really agreed, I think this is a very important conference for them, because as I said, it takes every 10 years. This type of conference takes place every 10 years. They wanted to look towards the 2020, 2022. And when they looked at that, they said that if we are least developed because of all these three criteria, our solution has to be looked at in all the three criteria, which means that they said that, look, if the economic growth is very low, if the income generation is very low, naturally you have a low income and the low economic growth. That's why they said that let us have a more concentrated focus on building productive capacity. Some countries are agriculture, some countries have minerals, some countries have other means of maybe tourism and others. So let us look at how best we can accelerate the process of development of these sectors. That will require, for example, a very strong infrastructure, because infrastructure is a big challenge, access to energy, better trading prospects for these commodities or these goods and these products. And they decided that this productive capacity building, including infrastructure and access to energy, has to be now #1 priority if we are talking about promoting economic growth in an inclusive manner. The second thing, they say that of course the human development is critical, the health and education, these are basic minimum, you have to also invest more on that. And the third thing they also stressed on is that how do you really build resilience? Now you have to build resilience from many things. One is that more and more countries, even if they are away from the major global markets, they are still integrated now, because many of them have at least some trading relationship with other countries, and which means that, and they are importing a lot of things from outside, which means that there is a very strong interconnection, if you like, between the countries around the world and these countries. But their capacity to really withstand a type of a crisis, for example, if the price really goes up, let us say, of the fuel, now how much that is going to impact these countries? A lot, because they don't have, many of them, they don't have the fuel resources, which means that they import, which means that the price of that will go up, and then how do you really find a balance in their budget in terms of really dealing with that? And then you have now disasters, which is affecting everyone more often than before. Then you have an impact of climate change. Now you have a financial and economic crisis. So we said that, look, they are already in a very low level of this economic growth and a very high level of poverty. For example, if you look at the LDCs in the 2001 and 2 period, their poverty level, almost 2/3 of the people were even below the poverty line of $1 a dollar. I mean, $1 a day is a very low level, but it's still 2/3 of the population. Now, in the last 10 years, because of MDGs, because of the concentration of many of the countries focused on these countries, they have made progress. But it's still almost half of the total population is still living below $1 a day. And that's a very big challenge. So, which means that they have made progress, but not fast enough, not deep enough. And that's what we would like, we talked about in the Istanbul. How to really accelerate it, how do you scale it up, and how do you ensure that there is more and more focus in terms of support that they get at the international level, whether it is the official development assistance or the trading access, market access for small products, or for their investment, what are the ways and means by which they can attract that type of the support from the international community.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're taking a look at the least developed countries, the small island development states, and landlocked countries, and looking at some of their particular challenges and how they're working on the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. My guest today is someone who's very knowledgeable of this area. My guest today is His Excellency Gyan Acharya, who is the Undersecretary General for the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. Mr. Undersecretary General, we're talking about the countries who are really struggling, and as you mentioned, they're really in a poverty cycle to a large degree, because there are three legs to the tripod.
That's right.
And if you're missing one of those legs, you just can't move out of it. But there is movement, there's progress. Let's talk a little bit about the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. These were adopted in 2000 by the majority of the countries at the United Nations General Assembly. There are 8 logical, practical, measurable goals to reduce abject poverty by 50% by 2015, to promote universal primary school education, to empower women, to reverse the AIDS pandemic, to promote sustainable development, and a few others. And your countries, the countries that you are representing and that you are focusing the limelight on, they are working on these, I'm sure, every day.
Sure.
We'll just pick one at random. Sustainable development. You mentioned the Maldives a few minutes ago,
Sure.
and that brings to mind the former president Mohammed Nasheed,
Right.
who was one who made a very dramatic statement by holding his cabinet meeting underwater wearing
Sure.
scuba gear.
Right.
And that got a lot of YouTube play, it got a lot of publicity, but it focused upon the Maldives as well as many other small island states that are sinking, and the water is rising because of climate change. Glaciers are melting, the seas are rising. How important is it to focus on sustainable development and on climate change in particular, not only for the small island states, but also landlocked countries are having problems with melting glaciers, and so are all of the least developed countries. But how important is that for you, those countries to really work towards it, and what are some of the gains being made?
Right. I mean, this is a very important question. I think now these countries are asking more and more. It used to be something distant. The climate change, yes, it affects us in a very distant way. Maybe the rain is not coming in time and all of that. It used to be like that, but it is no longer like that. You have a super storms coming. They are more frequent now than ever before. You have a sea level rise, which you already see in many of these countries, small islands that you just talked about. Many of these countries, look at the country like Maldives and Kiribati, they are very, just a few meters above the sea level. The entire land and the people living on the land there, they are just above a few meters above the sea level. Now, because of the rising temperature and the GHG emission, especially the greenhouse gas emissions is a major culprit for that. And we see already happening that there are a couple of things that are already happening. The ocean acidification is a major challenge. The salinization of the aquifer is a major challenge. Even losing the coastal region, the degradation and the losing, because of the sea level rise, they are a major immediate challenge. Now, this is not something that will happen in future. Now, they are already happening in a smaller scale, but you can already see that they are like a canary in the mine, and you they are in the front line. So you can see that already happening. So what is precisely these countries are saying, and this is what is very important for all of us to look at, is that look, we contributed very, very less, for the GHG emission, and now this is the brunt of the climate change is what we are facing disproportionately than others. We have nowhere to go. Same thing is being said by others. There is now the rainfall, which is very erratic now. You have extreme the temperatures and extreme volatility in rainfall, and this is impacting on the food security of many of the people, because they don't have elaborate irrigation structure, infrastructure in these countries. It's very expensive, so they depend on the natural rain for their agricultural products, and almost 70% of the people are still today doing agriculture in these countries, which means that if you don't have rain in time, which means that you don't have a good production, which means that if you look at the figures, you can see that the number of hungry people, number of countries with food security challenge is growing. Same thing is happening in parts of Africa, if you look at that, and in Asia as well. The desertification is a major challenge. So what we are saying is, yes, they are making their best of efforts in order to really deal with that. There are adaptations. If you have an infrastructure nearby all the coast, they are trying to build a resilient infrastructure. If they have the buildings, they are also trying to really climate proof if they can. They are trying to do that. But A, it is very costly, and two, if you don't mitigate the emission level and you go on continuing for adaptation, how long can they go on, how long can they go on doing it? That's the challenge. There are now countries which are saying, like, as I said, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and all these Maldives and others. What they are saying is that climate change is not an economic issue now anymore. It is a security threat for us. Now, if it really goes up to, let us say, 1 meter, 2 meters level, I mean, there are now predictions that, if we do not change our habit, if we do not reduce our emissions, I mean, the likelihood of that, of really having a big, the rise in the sea level is real now. I mean, we are talking about 2050 and 2060, which is not that far away. Everybody thought that it will come, later in somebody else's time, but that is not the case. We already see some of that happening. So what we are saying is that, yes, I mean, they can do as much as possible in terms of adapting to this climate change, but there is a limit to it, and that's why the international community has a very big responsibility, and the UN is trying its hard, its best to make sure that there is a fair but ambitious but also legally binding agreement, so that everybody does that, and then we hope that that will also help everyone.
That is absolutely critical. Of course, the United Nations has brought together the players, the countries of the world, the leaders, the governments, the private sector, non-governmental organizations, variety of different groups, and a myriad of conferences. And some of the most recent were the one in 2010, the Rio Plus 20 conference.
That's right.
And then last year, 2013, last year, in November, they had the Warsaw Climate Change Conference.
Yep.
Next year, there'll be one in New York and one in Lima, I believe, and then the following year in Paris. That is when the binding agreement is supposed to take place.
Sure.
It's been sort of very loose up to this point.
Sure.
People have sort of agreed on things, but they haven't signed on to it.
Right.
How important is it to reach a binding agreement, really a grand bargain, so to speak?
I think it is very, very important. I mean, precisely for the reason that it is like a global commons, I mean, you can get as much benefit out of it if everything is fine, but you can also pollute it as much as you like, but then the pollution is shared by all. And that's the discrepancy. Now, if these countries are at the receiving end of it, so what they are saying is that, I mean, everybody has to be responsible. They themselves, I was there in Marshall Islands, that was just 2-3 months ago, and they have the Pacific Islands, the heads of state and government were having a conference. And they were telling us that, look, we are not only telling the world that they should come out with ambitious outcome for this climate change conference. Even if we are small, we are contributing less. We are also going to contribute to that, which means that we are also switching our activities to more towards the sustainable energy, and all of the protection mechanisms that we are talking about in terms of really looking at the land and the ocean's relation. How do you really keep the ocean, the clean and all of that? We are trying to do our best. But we alone cannot do it, because this is much larger problem, because players are many, especially when you look at the health of the oceans now. These countries are dependent on the oceans, all these small islands. They may look like a small island, but they have a huge ocean. They are custodian of huge oceans around them. So, but their livelihood is also dependent on the fish and other. You look at the fish stocks, which is now, really going down, and all the fish stocks are going down. You look at the bleaching of coral reef. It is affecting the the marine ecosystem is really now degrading every year. So there has to be an international. That's what they are saying. If oceans are international properties or international assets, then everybody is going around the ocean. Everybody has a responsibility to make sure that the ocean's ecosystem is really protected. Just like that. Just like we talk about air, that we have to really make sure that we have the good the air for everyone, because there is no boundary for the air. Just like that, the oceans are also a common property of around the people around. But because they are there, they are the custodian of that, and that's why they think that, because they depend on ocean so much, every life, everything depend on that. That's why what they are saying, and especially the other countries as well. As I said, land degradation is a problem. The floods are a problem. Of course, the disasters is striking all these countries. Super storms, they strike even the big countries. We have even in New York, we have Sandy and all of that.
Right.
It affects all of that. But especially if you look at these smaller countries, the capacity of these countries to really recover from that, and to also to take the preventive measures, is very low. And that's why I think, although this disaster strikes all of them, but because they have a least capacity and the least amount of resources, their capacity to recover is very, very constrained. So what we are trying to do is that, how do you really build your resilience through international cooperation, through collaboration, sharing of information, and all of that, as well as preparing themselves for disaster risk reduction. Basically, how do you really reduce the disaster risk? And then that's why I think the climate change conference is very important. We don't have any global climate change related framework as of now. We have a Kyoto, but that is quite insufficient given the many changes that have taken place. Now, we all have to be responsible for that. So everybody has to contribute based on their capability, and that is what we are talking about. If you have a kind of a legally binding but fair agreement among all of them, based on their capacity, based on their contribution to the global emission and all of that, and then if we have an agreement on sharing of technologies, there are many technologies and information sharing and providing as much of a resources and capacity building for these countries, I think we will be in a much better place collectively than where we are now. So that is the main purpose of
exactly. And
climate change.
We all may not contribute to the pollution of the environment, the deterioration, but we all share in it, that's for sure.
Right.
Well, in the last minute or so that we have left, who are some of your partners? You have to have partners within the UN system. I'm assuming the UN Population Fund, Development Program, but who are some of your partners, very briefly?
You know that I am a high representative of the Secretary General, so my main responsibility is to really ensure coordination and coherence among all the agencies within the UN system. You are right. I mean, the UNFPA works, UNDP works, UNICEF, all the UN system, FAO works. All these systems that we have within the UN, there are about 29 funds and programs and all of that. We make sure that they give as much of a focus to these countries when you look at their challenges in the respective field. For example, UNICEF, the child mortality is the biggest challenge. And the maternal mortality is a big challenge. You look at the UNFPA population is a big challenge. UNDP looks at the development program. FAO and IFAD and other looks at the agriculture. So my job is also to ensure that within the UN system there is a strong coordination. But it is not only that. We also have, I have my responsibility to coordinate with others which are outside the UN system, like the World Bank, Regional Development Bank. But we work basically with the countries themselves and the development partners.
Exactly. Well, Undersecretary General Gyan Acharya, this is a very interesting topic, and I want to thank you for bringing us up to date on the least developed countries, landlocked countries, and small island development states. Thank you for a very interesting and very informative program.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Okay.
I'm Bill Miller. Thanks for joining us on today's Global Connections program.